Good evening and welcome to our Fulton Bible Institute study for this week. We appreciate you joining us. This is our third lesson in our series of the Old Testament. We will begin studying tonight, or we will study tonight, the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Solomon. We will look at these three books as they are the end of our study of wisdom literature, or the poets, the poetic books that make up with Job and Psalms, and then Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and Song of Solomon. So we appreciate you joining us here tonight as we get into this study. These books, as we're going to learn tonight, are books that are typically attributed to Solomon, as he was that wise king, the wisest man in all of Israel. So we're going to see that tonight as we study this book and say these three books and what they mean. I'll start with the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is Judaism's guide to successful living. Hebrew proverb may be a likeness, a comparison, a symbolic statement, or a parable. And so the Proverbs here are general lessons. They appeal to good judgment and to wisdom. And the interesting thing about this is the idea of wisdom in the Bible is wisdom is not, and this is going to apply to all three of these books, wisdom is not knowledge, is not what you know, it's how you use it. A person can be very knowledgeable but not be wise. To be wise means you know what to do and then you do it. And so this is what the Proverbs are going to be. The Proverbs are going to appeal to good judgment. They're going to appeal to living a life that is right with God. They're going to appeal to the idea of wisdom, not just knowing what to do, but doing something about it. So that's what we're going to study tonight as we go through this book, or these three books. We continue from there to see that Proverbs provide us God's detailed instructions for dealing successfully with practical, moral, and ethical affairs of everyday life. These Proverbs relate to parents, children, neighbors, and our government. So the Proverbs are going to be written to various audiences, various groups, and they're going to be very important statements for us to look at and for us to know. And they're, again, ideas of how to live a successful, godly life. The Proverbs also teach us by contrast of good and evil. Almost every verse in chapters 10 through chapter 15 are divided by the word but. The Proverbs will say one phrase, but, and then compare it with another one. And so this is the way they teach. This is these wise sayings. Again, Solomon is its principal author. He uses a combination of poetry, parables, riddles, short stories, and wise maxims to give common sense and divine perspective to life's challenges. And so Solomon will use the various ways of writing to convey to us some of the ideas, some of the thoughts about wisdom, and some of the thoughts about how we're to live and how we're to have a wise life for God. These Proverbs were written before 931 BC, and they were collected by Hezekiah about 230 years later. So these written by Solomon. Now Solomon dies in 930 BC, so these statements would have been given before that time period, and they were collected either they're either passed down, orally, or they were collected in some other book. And it's not until Hezekiah's reign that we have the book of Proverbs in the form we have it now. And again, that's not take away from the inspiration, not take away anything historically from this book. That's just the way we see things lay out. Solomon, we're told in 1 Kings 4:32, wrote or spoke about 3,000 proverbs. He is recorded to have over 3,000 proverbs to his name. In the book of Proverbs, there's about 800 of these. So it's interesting that that's sort of the idea of the attributing is 800 or so proverbs that are given here, and that's not even a third. Not even a third of what Solomon taught and what Solomon said in his life. So this is just a small snippet of what we're going to see. And we see these Proverbs by Solomon are given from chapter 1 to chapter 22, verse 16, and then chapters 25 to 29. What we're going to see is that middle section, we left out part of those verses in chapters 22, verse 17 through chapter 24, verse 34. These are credited to the words of the wise, meaning these were men who were wise. outside of Solomon, outside of Solomon's writing. Maybe they're writing Solomon collected or saying Solomon collected or what. We're not really sure, but they're just attributed to other wise men besides Solomon. Then Proverbs 30 is attributed to a man named Gur. And then finally Proverbs 31 is King Lemuel. Now King Lemuel, we have no information about these two figures. So we don't know anything about them. All we know is their names are mentioned as they have parts in the book of Proverbs. And so what we see is, again, the writings of the Proverbs were completely compiled sometime in the 5th century. So we have this long period. You have from Solomon, these wise men, and then these kings, or this king and Agur. Again, we don't really know what time period they were or who they were, other than their names are attributed to certain writings in the book of Proverbs. So these Proverbs are mostly from Solomon, like the Psalms were, but like the Psalms are attributed to David, Proverbs is primarily attributed to Solomon. However, there were some other writers who were involved here, otherwise being involved in this process. There's some distinctions to the book of Proverbs. The distinction of Proverbs is use of the personification of wisdom as women or as a woman. And the Proverbs will talk about pursuing woman wisdom. This is Proverbs 3:15, Proverbs 7:4, and then 7:4, verse 8 and verse 9. All speak about pursuing wisdom as a woman, or pursue the woman wisdom. Excuse me. And in Hebrew, the wisdom is a feminine noun, and the Proverbs reflect the historical background of Solomon's time. These Proverbs were written in the time of Solomon, a time when there was a certain need during Solomon's reign. And again, it was a more prosperous reign, a more well-off reign, but also there were some needs of his people. And again, this was the needs of his people in a time of economic age of luxury and prosperity. These Proverbs were Proverbs that were written at a time of not a time of need, but a time of plenty. And so they have this idea. But we know that the Lord, again, Psalm 46:1, the Lord is a present help in times of trouble. Therefore, he is equally needed in prosperity as he is in times of poverty. And so we see these Proverbs. These Proverbs, again, are not written during the necessarily bad times, but during good times. And that teaches a very important lesson, because sometimes in the bad times we know and we understand and we seek God, but it's in the good times we don't seek God. And so the Proverbs will remind us that these are the good times we need to seek God as well as the bad. Again, the Proverbs of Solomon seek to send a message of morality to the sinner or the simple. We'll talk about some words that he uses. One of the words he uses in the book of Proverbs is the word simple. When he talks about simple, the simple man, the simple person, they are the idea of sinners, those who are without God. And so Solomon cautions us in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, not to take the Proverbs in a secular sense as just another book of good advice, but to see it clearly as a book of godly principles. It is a book in which there is a value to. There's a book in which there is more to it than what we typically see or what we typically think as just another self-help book, if you will, what we would call it today. And so Solomon will warn us to pay attention to the book, to heed it, and to listen to it. And that is especially seen in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, because the first 9 chapters of Proverbs is different than the rest of the Proverbs, because it is a book of Proverbs from Solomon that are addressed as a father to his son. He will talk about, son, listen to your father. Son, hear these words. In the first 9 chapters are these Proverbs, these statements of a son to his father, or a father to his son. And then in Proverbs 10 is where we begin to see this breakdown in other things. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But in Proverbs 1 to Proverbs 9, he gives the fatherly advice about youthful temptations and how to avoid them through wisdom's counsel. And so he'll talk about how we ought to address and how we ought to look at the book of Proverbs. Now, we begin in chapter 1, the first 7 verses is a preface, the idea of the introduction of what this book is about. Beginning in verse 8 and going through the rest of Proverbs 1, there's the first admonition. The first admonition is to avoid bad company, to avoid those people who would bring you down. The rest of chapter 1, verses 20 through 33, is the idea of wisdom personified as a woman. Wisdom personified as one you ought to pursue. Then in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 1 through 22, we see the second admonition from Solomon, and that is to avoid the strange woman. Avoid the strange one. And again, the idea of strange is that this is a foreign woman, not your own woman, a loose woman. Those are different ways that you can identify that idea of a strange woman. And so he says to avoid her because she will lead you astray. She'll lead you off the path. Proverbs 3 is the third admonition. Verse 12 verses, trust in the Lord with all your heart. That idea of trusting in God. Then Proverbs 3, verse 13 through 20, he talks about the preeminence of wisdom, how important wisdom is and how important it is for one to have wisdom. And then Proverbs 3, verse 21 through 35 is the fourth admonition to love your neighbor. Love your neighbor and to follow them. Then you notice Proverbs 4, verse 1 through 9, the fifth admonition, and that is to get wisdom. He seeks his son to find wisdom, to go after wisdom, pursue it. Then Proverbs chapter 4, verses 10 through 19, again, is very similar to his first admonition, in that he admonishes his son to avoid bad company, to pay attention to those around. You'll notice these topics, and again, if you go back and read these sections, this is very practical, very solid advice for what the father wants his son to do. And these are words that all children, all people need to be reminded of. Proverbs 4, verse 20 through 27 is the admonition to guard your heart, to watch over it. Proverbs 5, 1 through 23 is his eighth admonition, and that is to drink water from your own cistern, not to go from other places, not to go to someone else's well, but to drink from your own and not stray. And typically that is tied to the relationship of the cistern or your own cistern, your own well, is to stay with your own wife, stay with the one you're married to, not go after, again, the strange woman. And that's a theme here, and you'll see this theme is to go after wisdom, because wisdom is what you need. The avoid bad company, watch out who you hang around, and then watch out for the loose woman, the foreign woman. And so this is sort of where these admonitions, that's the three main points he's going to talk about here, or three main topics. He just addresses them in different ways. Then Proverbs Chapter 6, we see a variety of special warnings that are given, verses 1 through 19. The first one is Proverbs 6, 1 to 5, to watch out or to pay attention to the pledge to a neighbor. If you make a pledge to your neighbor, this is what you need to do. Proverbs 6, 6 to 11 talks about the sluggard and what you need to know about him. Proverbs 6, 12 through 15 talks about the manipulator and what you need to know about him. And then Proverbs 6, 16 through 19 talks about the 7 things the Lord hates. And so these are very important, very key things to know and to be warned about. Proverbs 6, verse 20, he picks back up with his admonitions, where he gives his ninth admonition to beware of the adulteress, aware of that woman who is willing to forsake her marriage vow, and what you need to watch out for her. And then not only that, in Proverbs chapter 7, the 10th admonition goes sort of hand in hand with the ninth one, and that is to beware of the seductress, the one who would lure you away, the one who would pull you away, even if you're not in that relationship with another spouse, or she's not in another relationship. And so he warns about this woman, and then he goes in chapter 8 to talk about the woman you should pursue, and that is the woman wisdom. And then finally in chapter 9, verses 1 through 18, you have Lady Wisdom talked about compared to Madam Folly. And that's the other thing about the book of Proverbs, is you see this idea of the wise versus the fool, wisdom versus folly. Which one will you pursue? Which one will you go after? And you can see the idea here that Lady Wisdom is the one you should go after, not Madam Folly. And so Solomon will give some warning about these various things of how to serve and how to live and how to act. From there, we get into the longer section of Proverbs, and this is more miscellaneous Proverbs from Solomon. This goes from chapter 10, verse 1 to chapter 22, verse 16. These are dealing with the ordinary pursuits of life. And these proverbs are broad in tone, praising the reward of virtue, and probably come from the earlier days of his reign. This probably comes from Solomon's earliest reigns. And then in these words and these proverbs are typically just a verse or two, where the others before were sections. Now he just gives a verse. And again, these verses these topics are not correlated. he will jump from verse to verse. And so when we read the Proverbs, and let me say this, when you get to Proverbs 10 and follow, you have to pay attention to what you're reading, because it's not like many other books of the Bible in that when you start in verse 1 and you read down to verse 10 of a chapter, you expect to stay in pretty much the same idea, the same category. Not so the Proverbs. Chapter 1 may be over, or verse 1 may be over here talking about the fool and his mouth, and then verse 10 is talking about the woman to avoid, or how to live the right life. And so it jumps. So you have to pay attention to these. And again, if you read the Proverbs, you know this, but the book of Proverbs is one in which you have to take very special care in when you read it and when you study it. The next section, this is what we got on screen for us, is a section of the words of the wise. This words of the wise, it comes from Proverbs 22 to Proverbs 24:34. These proverbs were collected here, or the proverbs that were collected here, were apparently not written by Solomon, but collected from numerous sages. And again, exactly who collected these, we don't know. Most people think that probably Solomon collected these, and being a wise man, he acknowledged the wisdom of other men and their knowledge and their wisdom and what they did. So Solomon collected these, and these deal mostly with the things men should avoid. And this section is more focused. It's talking about things that men should avoid, and again, people should avoid not to be entangled in and not to let draw them away. From there, we get into Proverbs 25, chapter 25 to chapter 29. These proverbs are the ones collected by Hezekiah's men. These are the ones that are collected later. These sayings were evidently preserved orally and or in a written form from the days of Solomon until they were gathered together under Hezekiah's sponsorship. And again, these were sayings that were attributed to Solomon, but they were not collected in this form until Hezekiah's reign over 200 years later. And so they are separated. Again, the first 22 chapters are ones that Solomon had preserved himself, apparently. Then chapters 22 to 24 are various sayings from other wise men. Then chapter 25 to 29 are sayings that are attributed to Solomon, but they were not ones he wrote down. They were not ones he himself recorded, but ones that were accredited to him. And again, to see this book as part of God's Word, we would have no problem in understanding that those words would have been preserved, and therefore there's no question, no reason to doubt these words and doubt their authenticity, whether or not we should listen. Again, the idea of the Proverbs is that it is good, general, sound advice. And that's the other thing about the Proverbs. The Proverbs are not absolute truths. They are general truths. And what I mean by this is this. How many of us have heard the proverb, and we've talked about the proverb about raise a child in the way that he should go when he's older, not depart from it. And you talk about that verse. Every time we talk about that verse with a group of people, and we talk about church, it never fails. And I can testify this. It never fails. When you talk about that verse, somebody always raises their hand and say, well, I know so-and-so. I know so-and-so who is a good preacher, elder, deacon, good church member, whatever you want to say. He was a faithful Christian. He raised his son up in the church. They did everything they were supposed to do. And when that child got to 18, they went wild and they left the church. And how does that reconcile with what this proverb says? The proverb says, raise a child up and this is what's going to happen. They did that and it didn't happen. Does that mean the Bible is wrong? No. What that means is that proverb is a general truth, meaning that 8 to 9 times out of 10, this will happen. There are exceptions to the rule. But for the general purpose, for the majority of time, these sayings will come true. These sayings will pass. And so that's where we look at this idea. And I meant to bring that up earlier, and I forgot it, and I apologize for sort of inserting that here. But that's these idea. These things are general truths that will come true, that will generally come true. There are exceptions, but for the most part, these are general truths that will happen. We get to chapter 29, or chapter 30, the last, and we see the end of the book. The last few chapters are, again, attributed to otherwise unknown men. One is Agur. This is Proverbs 30, verses 1 through 33. And then lastly, the second, the man this is attributed to is chapter 31, verses 1 through 9 of King Lemuel. Now, I've got their own scripture here on the screen, name. It's supposed to be Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, is another poem. And there's some description, some question about this proverb, because some people think that this is written by King Lemuel, and some people think this is an anonymous. I think it's probably better to view this as an anonymous parable, or anonymous acrostic poem, if you will. And this is an anonymous acrostic poem that's used to praise a good wife. Probably one of the most taught scriptures of Proverbs as far as sermons and nowadays is the virtuous woman. But that is an acrostic poem. We talked about that last week. That's a poem where if you take the verses, verse 10 through 31, and you line them up in Hebrew, each verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so it's a description of that good, faithful woman. And so the Proverbs is a book of collected sayings that teach us the general truths, general ideas of what it means to be a good, godly person and what a good, godly, wise person will do in their life. Now, from here we get to our next, before we get there, excuse me, I forgot this one. As far as the topics in the Proverbs, there are some common topics that are talked about, and here's about 4 or 5 of them that are generally discussed. The first is the fate of the righteous versus the fate of the wicked. You can see these are just a couple of verses in the first few chapters that talk about these, that give this idea of where the righteous are headed versus where the wicked are headed. And therefore, the proverb of Solomon will say you've got to choose. Here's the destination of the wicked. Here's the destination of the wise. The righteous, which one are you going to be after? They'll also compare wisdom and folly. The idea of being a wise person versus being a fool. And again, the idea of being a fool is one who doesn't live wisely, one who doesn't live in a wise and faithful and true manner. There is the idea of diligence versus laziness. The diligent person, the hard worker, versus the lazy person. There's much profited on words in the tongue, what we do with those. And then finally, the idea of money. What do we do with our money? How does our money affect us? And the importance of using money wisely. And so those are just a few topics. Now let's proceed to the Book of Ecclesiastes. The Book of Ecclesiastes, again, can be summed up in this phrase, in this slide in front of you, life in a meaningless world. The Book of Ecclesiastes is, again, attributed to Solomon. It is a review of Solomon's lifelong search for happiness and the true worthwhile things of life. And so the idea is that the Book of Ecclesiastes is trying to figure out the purpose of life. The Hebrew title for this book is Koheleth, which is the preacher. And so you'll notice if you read the Book of Ecclesiastes, and we've been studying that on Sunday morning here at Fulton, you'll see that he talks about the preacher says. The preacher says. Well, that's what he attributes to himself. The Book of Ecclesiastes is the most deeply philosophical book in Scripture, and is unique in its vocabulary and style. It's a book unlike any other book in the Bible, and it is very philosophical, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking of what it's trying to teach and what it's trying to accomplish. The tone of the book is one of melancholy reflection. He looks back at his life. He looks back at the pursuits of his life and his decision of what to do and how those pursuits were valuable and how they were not. It was almost surely written in Solomon's later years of life when he is looking back. Again, it doesn't make sense for this book to be written early in life, but after he has lived a good long life and he looks back at all the things he's done, of everything he's been through, and he has to wonder, well, where was life? The interesting thing about the Book of Ecclesiastes is that this book is nowhere quoted in either the Old or New Testament. It's one of the few books that are not quoted by any other book, any other scripture writing, no other reference about this book. And that's understandable because of the context of this book. The Book of Ecclesiastes is very hard to break down exactly what this is. We'll do the best we can. But it's more broke down in the Book of Proverbs. It's more about topics, more about things that he wants us to teach and wants us to know. But we can look at Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. There's a short prologue introducing this book. The preacher talks about what he's done and talks about his vanity of vanities, all his vanity. And a few things to talk about here, to talk about, and I apologize for not having them on the screen, is a few words to notice in the Book of Ecclesiastes is, one, the word vanity, futility, the worthlessness of this thing. And two, we have to be careful when we read the Book of Ecclesiastes to see if he's talking about life in general or if he's speaking of life in the sun. If he talks about life in the sun or under the heavens or on the earth, he's talking about an earthly life that is not centered on God. And so he compares that. So we have to be very careful because he'll make some statements that to us will say, how can a God-given person say this? That doesn't line up with anything of Scripture. And we have to look back and say, okay, well, he's talking about under the sun. He's talking about a time under the sun. He's talking about a time that's not at this time of life. And so that's what we're looking at as we talk about this. And so the book of Ecclesiastes begins this way with this introduction. Then beginning in verse 12 and going through chapter 6, verse 12, the first major section of reflection on the vanity of vanities, or vanity of various subjects, for real devotion to God. And so he's going to talk about some areas that are vanity. Ecclesiastes 1, 12 through chapter 2, verse 26, talks about the vanity of human wisdom, the futility of being a wise person. Then beginning in chapter 3 and going through chapter 6, verse 12, talks about disappointing experiences of life. Chapter 3 is about the prudent attitude toward life and death. Again, that idea, time to reap and a time to sow, a time to build and a time to tear down, and so forth and so on, where it says everything there is a season, everything there is a time. And he talks about the attitude toward life and death. There's a time of living and a time of dying, and that's just part of life. Chapter 4 is going to talk about the disappointments of earthly life, that earthly life will disappoint you. Life under the sun will fail. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, there's a futility of the self-seeking life. If your life is focused on self, your life is focused on only what you want, what you desire, there's a futility, there's a vanity in that life. And then finally in chapter 6, verse 1 through 12, there's a frustration of ambition and desire. Even ambition and desire will fail. They will mess up. And so in chapter 7 through chapter 12, the ecclesiastical writer will go to his second major section of a number of wise sayings to point to a positive outcome for the book. He begins to talk about some wise saying. Chapter 7, he'll talk about the counsel of the prudence in a world corrupted by sin. There's wisdom in this world if we will listen to them. Chapter 8, verse 1 through 17, there's acceptance of the imperfect world. To realize this world is not perfect, therefore we cannot make it perfect. Therefore we cannot be perfect in this world and live by its standards. Chapter 9, he tells us to make the best of this life, to make the best of what you have and realize this life is passing, this life is fleeting. Chapter 10, there's the uncertainty of life and the effects of folly, of how folly can hurt and how folly can tear down. And then finally, Ecclesiastes 11, chapter 11 through chapter 12, verse 8, he speaks about how to best invest in life. Where we ought to look and what we ought to seek. And then he ends this great book in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 9 through 14, to reach his conclusion, to reach out to God. Ecclesiastes 12, 9 and 10, the preacher's purpose was to teach his people wisely concerning the nature of life, to realize that life, that true life, true existence is not in this world. It is not under the sun. It is not anything on this world, but is living for God. Then Ecclesiastes 12, 11 and 12, the value of these words is greater than all literature. All the books you can read, all the books you can find, they will not teach you more than what the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to teach you, that you need to follow God and live for God and serve God. And then Ecclesiastes 12, 13 and 14 talks about the whole of man, the whole duty of man, the fear God and keep his commandments. And so we see this idea of Ecclesiastes comes down to this conclusion that in this life, in this world, in what we live and how we live and how we do and all things we partake of, there is futility, there is uselessness, there is vanity. It's only when we look to God and serve him that we can truly find acceptance, we can truly find purpose, and we can truly strive to be the people God has called us to be. In this book of Solomon, he talks about when we talk about the vanity of vanities, he talks about the things in life that he sought happiness in. There are 4 areas he sought happiness in. Number 1, he sought wisdom. Number 2, he sought wealth. Number 3, he sought power. And number 4, he sought pleasure in wine and pleasure in women. And all these things, he said it was vanity of vanities. And this is very important. This is what we've been talking about on Sunday morning here at Fulton, is the purpose of these things and about what these things, how these things will fail and how they will not last and how they will fall to the wayside. We end this study tonight in the Song of Solomon. We look at the last book of the wisdom literature. Song of Solomon is a unique song about human love. The Hebrew title for this book is Song of Songs, i.e., the best of songs. like King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the King, the Lord of all lords. This is the best of all songs, is what he says. Now, certain rabbinic sources indicate the book's inclusion in the certain rabbinic sources, they question the words missing. They question the book's inclusion in the canon because of the erotic nature of the material. This is a very unique book. Just like Ecclesiastes was unique, this book is unique. This book is different. It's not like the other books. It's not like anything else in the Bible. And so some will question whether or not it belongs. And what some people will do is they try to view this book as an allegory. They'll try to view this book as a description of how God feels toward Judaism, or in our case, Christian age, how Christ feels for the church. And they'll say, well, that's what this book is about. It's about talking about the love of Christ for the church. However, those are some ways to take this book, but honestly, the best way to take this book is to take it as it appears. To take this book as it is a love letter. And a very beautiful love letter that the writer will talk about. And we are talking about this here right down Valentine's Day, or after Valentine's Day when you see this. And so this book is a book about the beauty and holiness of married love. The beauty of God-given love, of a man's relationship with his wife. Now, in this book, God's name does not appear. God's name is not used in the book of Song of Solomon, so that makes it a book to stand out for. So the book breaks down this way, the Song of Songs. Chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 7, the song begins about married love between the bride longing for her beloved and praising him. Again, this is the Song of Solomon. Some people question whether this was a song written by Solomon or written by somebody else, because we know Solomon, he had many wives, he had many concubines. How can you do this? And apparently what most scholars think, and I believe too, that there was this woman, this Shulamite woman that he meets, that makes him question all of his polygamous relationship, makes him question all these marriages he's had for political reasons, to see the value in the true, the one reason for marriage, the monogamous marriage between one husband and one wife. And so we see this. And then you go to chapter 2, verse 8 through chapter 3. We're going to see two interactions between the praise for their beloved. The first is the bride praises her husband. Chapter 2, verse 8 through chapter 3, verse 5. Then chapter 3, verse 6 to chapter 5, verse 1. The husband longs for and praises his bride. He talks about her beauty and about his longing for her. And then in chapter 5 through chapter 5 verse 2, through chapter 6 verse 9, the bride longs for the husband's return after he has been away for some time. Again, there's some reason the husband's away, and the bride longs for him to come home. And then from chapter 6 verse 10 to chapter 8 verse 4, we see when the two lovers are rejoined, the beauty of the bride is extolled at some length. The groom praises his wife and praises her beauty. And then finally we see Song of Solomon chapter 8 verse 5 through verse 14. The book closes with an affirmation of the strength of true love. And so we see this beautiful book by Solomon written about the true love of life. And again, it's a very interesting book to study. It's one that we typically neglect, we turn away from, but it's one that has great value, especially for married couples, because it tells us about how God wants us to talk about each other, how we should feel about our spouse. And some people think that the reason Solomon wrote this was, again, he was one who was married to many women and had these many concubines, but yet he wrote that in all that, the greatest fulfillment, the best fulfillment was when he followed and did what God had commanded, when it was one man and one wife. And so that is the beauty of the book of Song of Solomon, is that feeling of a husband toward a wife. Very beautiful book to study. This brings us to the end of our study tonight. We appreciate you joining us here tonight. What we have done so far in our study between last quarter and this quarter is we have talked about the books of his law. That's first 5 books. We talked about the books of history. That's from Joshua, to Esther. Now we've talked about the wisdom books, the poetic books. Next week we will begin studying about the prophets. We will look at the major prophets and the minor prophets, and we'll talk more about those next week. We're going to look at those prophets as far as the major prophets are concerned. We're going to take one prophet a week and look at him. And then we're going to spend the last 3 or 4 weeks talking about 3 or 4 minor prophets at a time, and we can cover that fairly easy. But for tonight, I appreciate you being here with us tonight. Appreciate you tuning in and watching these videos. We appreciate all of everyone's kind words and everyone's involvement. Again, we hope that you and your family are doing well. We hope, like say, after this quarter, we can get back to our normal routine. But until we're able to do that, we hope that you and your family are well, you and your family are blessed. And again, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call us. Don't hesitate to let us know. We can help you out however we can. But again, tonight, appreciate your attention. Appreciate you being here. We hope that you're having a God-blessed week, and we hope to see you again next time.